Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
You know that moment when someone looks you in the eye, smiles kindly, and says something that cuts cleaner than a blade ever could? That's what my mother did to me on a chilly Sunday morning, about a week before the Whitmore family legacy night. She stood at the head of the kitchen island, wearing that ironed cream blouse she saves for special occasions, and said with the smoothness of someone who truly believes they're being generous, "Rachel, I think this event should really be for the kids who've made us proud. Claire's keynote is already written, and Mark's bringing his startup team in from San Francisco. It's going to be so accomplished." She used that word like a weapon, and I smiled, nodded, and sipped my black coffee like it didn't taste like ashes. I didn't fight her, not that day. I didn't ask her what accomplished meant, or whether the last 15 years of my life building something that mattered to thousands of people qualified at all. Because I already knew her answer. It didn't. Not unless it could be summarized in a Christmas card or worn around the neck like a gold medal. And me? I was the quiet daughter, the one who left law school, the one who never married, never posted baby bump photos, never moved into a 2-story colonial with granite countertops and a golden retriever named Buddy. I was the one who started working out of a half-done garage in Richmond on a prototype that even I didn't fully believe in yet. The one they never really introduced to their friends. I was the one who never made the mantle. That morning, while she kept talking about seating charts and donor lists and keynote speakers, I just stood by the fridge, nodding every now and then, the sound of her voice blurring into background noise. I remembered being 12 when I won the statewide science fair with a hand-built soil filtration model, and how she spent the whole drive back to Charlottesville telling me how my shirt looked wrinkled in the photos. I remembered being 23 when I got accepted into a NASA internship, and she asked why I didn't get into something more practical. And I remembered last Christmas when she gave me a candle and a reusable shopping bag, while my siblings unwrapped $1,000 gadgets and framed family portraits of their kids. So when she said, "Let's keep this event just for the kids who've made us proud," I didn't flinch. I'd already been trained, conditioned, expected to take the back seat, clap politely, and smile like I was part of the same celebration, even if my name wasn't on any of the banners. But I'd been working on something, quietly, far from their spotlights and dinner parties. I'd built a modular water purification system that was currently running in 4 low-income towns across the South. No fancy ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press release, just thousands of people drinking clean water for the first time in years, because I stayed up all night soldering wires and blowing past failed tests for 5 straight years. And now, someone had noticed. That email came 2 days later. I almost missed it, buried between a spam ad for orthopedic shoes and a client request to update a firmware patch. The subject line was bland. "Congratulations, Rachel, National Humanitarian Recognition." I clicked it, expecting it to be a scam. It wasn't. It was real, very real. The kind of recognition that got cameras in rooms and headlines in national news. The kind of award that made people pay attention. I stared at the email for a long time, rereading it 3, 4, 5 times. Then I closed the laptop and sat in silence, trying to remember the last time someone said they were proud of me. That Saturday, the house was buzzing. Mom had gone full gala mode, as my dad called it, though he said it with the same tone someone uses to describe a hurricane coming in. Mark's kids were running around the backyard with custom-printed shirts. Claire's husband was flying in from Boston, and someone had booked a string quartet for the foyer. I watched from the edge, holding a glass of something expensive and tasteless, listening to stories about IPOs, med school, book deals, and milestone anniversaries. My name didn't come up once. I stood there by the coat rack when I saw the photos, giant ones, framed and propped on easels, Claire shaking hands with a senator, Mark holding up a certificate. Even their kids made it, one in a karate uniform, another holding a spelling bee trophy. There were no photos of me, not even the grainy one from my high school graduation. It was like I didn't happen. And here's the part where I need to ask you something. Maybe it'll make sense of what comes next. What do you do when the people who raised you make it clear they only celebrate you if you fit the mold they built from scratch? Do you walk away quietly, or do you rewrite the mold? Because that night, I didn't just watch. I didn't just sip wine and let my name stay buried in the shadows. I waited. I watched. And then, with a press badge in my pocket and an invitation forwarded directly from the National Recognition Board, I walked into the hall, stepped past the photos, past the champagne flutes and the garden lights, and onto the stage. Not because I needed their pride, but because I'd earned it, with or without their damn permission. And in the audience, just for a split second, I saw my mother's smile fall like a dropped plate, clean, sudden, and impossible to glue back together. The day of the event crawled forward like an animal that knew it was heading toward slaughter, not because the sky looked grim or the weather turned dark. No, it was sunny, perfect even, the kind of weather my mother would call a blessing from above, but because the silence in the house felt like it had been swept under a rug that was already bulging with years of unsaid things, of glances exchanged and quickly diverted, of memories that didn't match the glossy photo albums displayed in the living room. By early afternoon, the driveway was packed with SUVs and spotless sedans, each one polished like a mirror and parked at tight angles, as if the sheer geometry of expensive vehicles could affirm the success of the people arriving. My mother stood in the front hall like a pageant host, greeting each new wave of guests with the same laugh, the same perfect line about how proud they were of all their wonderful, brilliant children, and how it was so special to finally bring everyone together in one place to celebrate family legacy, though she never said what that legacy actually was, only that it sparkled under soft lighting and cost more than the neighbors could afford. I watched from the upstairs landing, standing behind the curtain of a guest room window, like I was hiding in my own home, because in truth, I was. The house no longer belonged to any of us. Not really, it belonged to the narrative my mother crafted over decades. One made of curated stories and omitting details like my absence from every family Christmas newsletter since 2014. As I looked down on the gathering crowd, something in my stomach twisted, not with jealousy, but with a kind of detachment that felt dangerous, like the moment before you stopped trying entirely. I'd seen the setup earlier that morning, just after dawn, when I slipped outside before anyone else was awake. The backyard had been transformed into what looked like a political fundraiser, a white tent large enough to house a wedding, rows of chairs in perfect symmetry, a stage at the far end with floral arrangements flanking either side, and a screen hanging above it set to play a slideshow that, even from a distance, I could tell wouldn't feature me. Later, as the guests began to gather in clusters around the open bar and charcuterie boards the size of a twin bed, the slideshow began. And just like I'd predicted, there was Claire, walking across the stage at her law school graduation, smiling in a crisp navy suit that probably cost more than my rent. Then came Mark, mid-pitch at some tech conference in Munich. The crowd blurred behind him, a standing ovation in full force. Even their kids had moments. A perfectly lit piano recital, a soccer goal mid-strike, a homemade volcano erupting in slow motion, while proud parents clapped in the background. I stood at the very edge of the yard, leaning against the fence post with a plastic cup of wine and no name tag, watching faces light up with applause, laughter, and the kinds of expressions people say for things they feel included in. My father stood near the stage, wearing the same soft smile he always wore, the one that said, "I'm proud of everyone," while really meaning, "I'm too tired to argue with your mother." And my mother, well, she was in her element, gliding between groups, kissing cheeks, adjusting napkins, and pulling people toward the photo wall like it was the goddamn Louvre. It was then, in that surreal mix of manicured celebration and quiet exclusion, that a memory hit me like a gut punch. I was 17, sweaty and tired from a 3-hour robotics showcase at state finals, clutching a folder full of patent interest letters from regional sponsors. I came home, exhilarated, only to find my parents already at dinner, discussing Claire's college roommate drama and how Mark had aced another AP exam. I'd held up the folder like a trophy, expecting someone, anyone, to ask, "What's that?" But all I got was a distracted nod and a half smile, followed by a question about whether I'd remember to take out the recycling. That night, I threw the folder under my bed and didn't touch it again for 6 years. Standing there now, older, quieter, and far more dangerous than I'd ever been at 17, I realized something crystal clear. This wasn't just about feeling excluded. This was about erasure. About someone choosing, consciously and consistently, to write you out of the story. Because your page didn't match the theme of the book they were trying to publish. And there, in the pit of that realization, I made a decision, not an emotional one, but a deliberate, surgical one, that I wouldn't stay a ghost in the house I grew up in. I wouldn't let them pretend I didn't exist just because I didn't fit the color scheme. So I did something that would have horrified my mother. I made a call, not to a friend or a therapist, not to someone who would pat my back and say, "You're still valid," but to someone who owed me a favor, someone who once told me if my water purification prototype ever went live, he'd get it in front of people who mattered. I didn't even know if he'd pick up, but he did. "Rachel Whitmore," he said, voice smooth and amused. "You finally ready for your name to mean something outside of your family's shadow?" I didn't hesitate. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "I'm ready for the world to know what I've built, and I want it to happen in the most public way possible." There was a pause, then laughter. "You always did have impeccable timing." When I hung up the phone, my hand was shaking. Not from fear, from power. I wasn't crashing their party. I was about to rewrite the damn program. And somewhere deep in the background, under the weight of cello strings, and praise so thick it could suffocate a small town, my mother was preparing to go on stage and introduce her perfect children. She didn't know it yet, but the spotlight was about to shift. And this time, it wasn't going to be on Claire, or Mark, or anyone in a piano recital. It was going to be on the daughter they thought had nothing to show. The morning of the event was drenched in the kind of electric stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. Though the sky was cloudless, and the air unusually crisp for early May, and while my mother bustled around the rented tent, adjusting place settings and reminding the AV team about timing cues, I sat in a coffee shop 5 blocks away, laptop open, email inbox glowing with unread messages, and in the center of it all, highlighted in red, marked urgent, flagged by the assistant of someone I had once considered out of my league, was the official confirmation that the National Humanitarian Recognition Board would, indeed, be presenting my award that evening, not in a separate event, not at some later function, but in real time, on the very stage my mother had insisted was reserved only for the children who've made us proud. The irony was so sharp, it felt almost cartoonish, as if some divine hand had decided that poetic justice was best served with wine spritzers and decorative name tags. And as I sipped my lukewarm coffee, I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not vengeance exactly, but a quiet release, like unclenching a fist that had been balled so tightly for so long, you'd forgotten what it felt like to stretch your fingers. They'd invited the media. That much I knew from my brother Mark, who, with a cocky grin and a casual flex of his well-tailored jacket, had mentioned last week that a couple of local outlets might be dropping by to cover the family's legacy, whatever that meant. I hadn't told him, hadn't told any of them, that my award was not only national, but thanks to some unexpected legislative traction, tied to a pending federal initiative that was about to put my name in the mouths of people who spent their lives ignoring women like me. The call I made 2 days earlier had worked, not because I begged, not because I pulled some favor from a dusty drawer, but because the numbers spoke for themselves. Clean water systems successfully deployed in 4 low-income towns across 3 states, over 25,000 people now drinking safely, hospitals reporting a 30% drop in waterborne illnesses, and local economies slowly stabilizing thanks to reduced medical costs and increased productivity. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't sexy, it didn't come with a TED Talk or a photo shoot. But it mattered. And now someone with a suit and a clipboard and a press badge had decided that it mattered enough to shine a spotlight directly onto the stage. My mother had spent the last month orchestrating down to the last fork placement. I arrived late, Not fashionably late, strategically late. I wore black. Not dramatic black, solid, unobtrusive, unassuming. I slipped past the valet like a guest who belonged, past the hors d'oeuvres table where three women in pearls discussed Claire's latest book deal, past the seating chart where my name was nowhere to be found, and finally to the side entrance near the equipment tent, where the event coordinator, a woman named Janelle, with headset and a clipboard thicker than a Bible, looked up, glanced at my lanyard, and said, "You're the award recipient? They didn't tell me it was you." I smiled. They didn't know. The moments before I went on stage were a blur of polite chaos. Mic checks, light adjustments, a speech reprinted last minute when I asked them to swap a line about female innovators with quiet revolutionaries. And then I was standing just behind the curtain, the murmur of the crowd bleeding through, the cello playing something slow and mournful. And in the front row, as predicted, sat my entire family. My mother on the aisle, upright, composed, her expression fixed like porcelain. My father beside her, looking somewhere between proud and concerned. Claire whispering something to her husband while checking her phone, and Mark balancing a wine glass on his knee, unaware of what was about to land. The announcer cleared his throat. He spoke with that cadence people use when trying to sound official, but his voice trembled slightly when he said my name, and as the syllables echoed across the tent, you could almost feel the temperature shift. Heads turned. My mother's jaw moved. No words, just motion. She blinked. Once, twice. I stepped into the light. No one clapped right away. There was a pause. Not because they didn't want to, but because their brains needed a second to catch up to their eyes. I didn't look different. I didn't wear a cape or carry a trophy. I just stood there, hands resting lightly on the podium, and began to speak. I didn't mention my mother. I didn't mention my family at all. I spoke about water, about the kids in rural Arkansas who no longer missed school from stomach infections, about the grandmother in East Texas who cried the first time she boiled water that didn't smell like rust, about the small team of technicians, mostly women, mostly underpaid, who'd helped me bring this system to life. I talked about failure, about resilience, about how some victories don't come with applause or applause-worthy packaging. And when I finished, the silence held for just a moment longer than it should have. Then came the applause, not scattered or polite, but volcanic, rising like it had been waiting all night for something real to erupt through the glitter. As I stepped down, cameras flashed. Reporters stood, microphones extended. I didn't stop. I walked past every face I'd grown up fearing, past my mother's frozen expression, now twisted just enough to show the edges of disbelief, and out into the night air, which felt warmer than it should have, like the universe had leaned in and whispered, "Finally." In that moment, it wasn't revenge I felt. It was reclamation, not of the past, but of the present, of the story, and it had only just begun. The hours after stepping off that stage were a blur, not in the way people usually describe fame or chaos, but in the quieter, more personal way that your mind detaches from reality when it's finally allowed to process something monumental, like your body having caught up to a moment your spirit had already lived through in a dozen daydreams, each one sharper than the last, each one steeped in a quiet hunger you learned to suppress as over years of being the person no one applauded for. I didn't go back into the crowd after the award, didn't circle through the tent or stand by the bar pretending to casually sip a drink while waiting for someone to recognize me. Instead, I walked past the final row of chairs, past the spotlight that had only minutes earlier exposed me in all my complicated truth, and slipped around the side of the house into the garden path, letting the weight of it all press into my ribs like a truth I'd carried for too long without language. What I remember most isn't the speech itself or the faces in the audience, but the echo of silence that followed when I finished speaking, the kind of silence that comes not from disinterest or boredom, but from shock, from reevaluation, from the shattering of an idea people were so comfortable believing that the truth feels like a betrayal. My mother hadn't clapped. Not once. She sat there with her hands folded in her lap, not tight or angry, just still, like someone trying to remain composed in the face of something they didn't plan for. And while the rest of the audience eventually erupted in applause, loud, cathartic, the kind of clapping that carries approval and awe, her hands remained motionless, her face unreadable, and in that stillness, I understood something profound. Her silence was not confusion, it was loss. You see, she had built a story about who I was, who I wasn't, and what success looked like. And she had done it with such precision over so many years that it had calcified into something immovable, something foundational to the identity she paraded at church potlucks and charity luncheons. I was the cautionary tale, the quiet one who never quite measured up, the daughter with potential that just went a different way. And now that narrative had been ripped out from under her in public, under the lights, on camera, in front of the very people she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. There was no recovering from that. Not cleanly, not with spin or denial. After I left the tent, I ended up in the guest house, the one my parents used to rent out on Airbnb before my mother decided it didn't match her brand, and sat on the edge of the old couch with a bottle of water in my lap. The silence around me feeling thick and padded like a hotel lobby in the middle of the night. My phone was blowing up. Notifications from Twitter, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. A few texts from old classmates saying things like, "Holy crap, was that really you?" And "Just saw you on the news. Your mom must be freaking out." But none of it felt as satisfying as I thought it would. None of it made the years of being overlooked dissolve. It didn't hurt anymore, not exactly, but the scar still itched, like it wanted to remind me of everything it had endured to get here. And that's when I saw the door open. She didn't knock. Of course she didn't. My mother walked into the guest house like she still owned everything on the property, including me, and stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping fully inside, her heels clicking against the tile with the kind of precision only a woman who's spent her life managing appearances can muster. She didn't sit, didn't offer a hug, didn't even acknowledge the cameras or the applause or the award still sitting beside me on the coffee table. Instead, she crossed her arms, tilted her head, and said, with that terrifyingly calm tone she reserved for moments of deep disapproval, "You blindsided me, Rachel. You embarrassed this family." I didn't say anything, not yet. I just looked at her, really looked, and wondered how long she had been waiting to say those words, how long she'd been practicing that exact sentence in her mind. Ever since she heard my name echo through the tent, I expected anger. I expected disappointment. But what I didn't expect, what stopped me cold, was the flicker of something else in her eyes, fear. She wasn't just upset. She was afraid. Afraid that the version of events she'd curated so carefully for decades had finally cracked, and that the people she'd tried so hard to impress might start asking questions she couldn't answer. I leaned back on the couch, took a sip of water, and let the silence hang between us until it became unbearable. "I didn't embarrass anyone," I finally said. "I told the truth. You're just not used to it being mine." She exhaled through her nose, sharp and short. "This wasn't your moment, Rachel. You made it about you when it should have been about all of us." "All of us?" I laughed, not bitterly, but with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from years of fighting a war no one admits exists. "You mean Claire, Mark, their perfect little families, their predictable lives. You mean the version of us that doesn't include the daughter you couldn't explain to your friends." She looked like she wanted to argue. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her jaw clenched, but no words came. Eventually, she turned and walked out without another word, and the sound of the door clicking shut behind her was louder than the applause had been. That night, alone in the guest house, I rewrote my speech. Not because I planned to give it again, but because I needed to see it with fresh eyes. I needed to write the version I would have given if I didn't care about being polite. The version that said, "You ignored me, and I let you," and "You pretended I didn't count, and I believed you." The version that ended not with a quote or a hopeful note, but with the truth. "This isn't revenge. This is reclamation. You built a legacy without me. Now I'm building one without you." And as I sat there under the dim yellow light, watching the awards shimmer like a secret finally told, I realized the most shocking thing of all. I didn't need her to be proud. I just needed her to listen. The morning after the event broke like a wave I hadn't seen coming, not because I didn't expect consequences. God knows I did. But because nothing prepares you for the full velocity of attention that crashes into your life when the curtain of anonymity finally drops, and you're no longer just a background character in someone else's carefully curated narrative, but the headline, the center, the storm that people either want to shelter under or flee from entirely. I woke up on the couch in the guest house with the light cutting through the slats of the blinds in harsh streaks, my neck stiff, my phone somewhere under a pile of papers and water bottles, buzzing like it had grown a nervous system of its own, pulsing with alerts and calls and messages, each one louder than the last. For a few seconds, maybe 30, maybe less, I sat there in the stale air, not moving, not blinking, just letting the sound of the day after surround me, trying to delay the inevitable moment when I would have to face the reality of what I'd done, of who I'd become, not the quiet daughter anymore, not the overlooked one, not the one who'd fade politely into the background while others took the stage and the credit. I was no longer invisible. But with visibility comes scrutiny, and with scrutiny comes judgment. And with judgment comes the weight of knowing that even when you win, even when you do it with grace and brilliance and calm fury, there will be people, some very close to you, who will only ever see it as betrayal. By the time I found my phone, the screen had gone white with missed notifications. News apps, social media mentions, a dozen LinkedIn requests, 2 voicemail messages from a local reporter asking for a statement, and 1 message from an unknown number that simply read, "They're talking about you on the morning show. You should see it." I didn't click the link. I didn't need to. I already knew what the angle would be. Daughter of prominent family surprises with quiet tech triumph. Or maybe something more dramatic like, family gala upended by unexpected hero. But it didn't matter because the story, once mine, was now out in the wild, spinning beyond my control, interpreted and misinterpreted by people who had never met me, who didn't know the texture of the silence I'd grown up in, who didn't know how much of myself I had to mute just to survive under that roof. What I didn't expect, and what threw me more than any news coverage or social media storm, was the phone call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail the first time, because frankly, I didn't think I could hear her voice without hearing that familiar disappointment stitched into every syllable, that high-functioning denial she wore like a second skin, pretending nothing ever happened, that everything could go back to normal if we all just agreed to never speak the truth out loud again. But she called again, and again. And finally, on the 4th attempt, I answered. She didn't say hello. She didn't say congratulations. She didn't ask if I was okay or if I needed anything or if I was proud of what I'd done. She said, in a voice so measured it sounded rehearsed, "You blindsided me. You hijacked a moment that was supposed to be about family. Do you even understand what you've done?" And I laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, just softly, because that one sentence, that one perfect summation of who she had always been, told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. "I didn't hijack anything," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as I could manage. "I was the moment. You just didn't see it coming because you've never looked at me unless it was to see what you thought was missing." There was silence on the other end, not the kind that invites reflection, but the kind that warns you no progress will be made here. Not now, maybe not ever. And then she said quieter this time, almost as if to herself, "You made me look like a fool." I didn't respond, because in that sentence was the confession. What hurt her wasn't the truth I told, or the work I'd done, or the lives I'd helped save. What hurt her was that the story she'd told the world about who she was and what kind of mother she had been could no longer hold water. Her embarrassment mattered more than my achievement. So I hung up. Not angrily, not as a declaration, just with a quiet click that said more than words could. And I turned the phone off and threw it across the couch. Not to break it, but to distance myself from the noise. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want praise. I didn't want another round of, "You go, girl," from strangers who'd forget my name by next week. I just wanted air, stillness, something that felt like mine again. A few hours later, someone knocked on the guest house door, but not the kind of knock that demanded attention, not the harsh kind that followed confrontation. It was soft, familiar. When I opened it, Aunt Linda stood there with 2 cups of coffee and a look on her face that said she'd been waiting years for this conversation. She didn't hug me, didn't say she was proud. She just handed me the cup, sat down on the couch and said, "Took you long enough?" We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. She was the only one who'd ever seen me clearly, even when I didn't have the words to describe myself. Even when I was still building pieces of myself in secret, like a mechanic working under a hood in the dark. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. She knew. And in her presence, I felt something settle in me, not closure, not forgiveness, but grounding. After she left, I found a note on the windowsill, one I hadn't noticed earlier, folded in half with my name written in simple block letters. No envelope, no signature. Inside it read, "You were never invisible to me. Keep going." There was no way to tell who wrote it, no handwriting I recognized, no clues. Maybe it was Linda, maybe it was someone else entirely, but it didn't matter. Because in that moment, I understood that the road ahead wasn't going to be paved with recognition or redemption or sudden reconciliation. It was going to be lonely sometimes, and sharp, and it would require a new kind of courage, the kind that doesn't just fight to be seen, but dares to remain visible, even when the people who once ignored you finally start to look. And as I sat there holding that note, the sun lowering through the window in golden slants, I made a quiet promise, not to forgive, not to forget, but to continue. Because this was never about revenge. This was about building something they couldn't erase. Something that outlasted them. Something mine.